Jamatul Mubarak to everybody. Let's begin our pre-budget webinar, which is of extreme importance because budget aane wala hai, budget is around the corner. It's going to be in June. It's going to be a very important budget. We've had a change of finance minister. The new finance minister has made some important announcements, like he wants to renegotiate with the fund, like he wants to back small enterprises, like he wants to put growth on top, which is welcome news. So there is going to be a change of direction, and what better time to talk about the change of direction than now? And we are very happy that this is the first of our pre-budget webinars. We are probably going to try and do two or three of them with the best economists from Pakistan. We have with us today a team that I think you will agree is the best possible in Pakistan. We will have other such teams soon. The point is to network all the Pakistani thinkers and provide the government with the best thought possible in a collaborative fashion and not individually. So we've got today with us Dr. Hafiz Pasha, former finance minister, former minister of planning, and the former Assistant Secretary General of the UN, and other credits to him. Everybody knows Hafiz Pasha. He's been a professor, probably raised the largest crop of students in Pakistan, and I think he's more proud of his being a professor. Just 1 second. So Dr. Pasha just called. He's lost his electricity, but he'll join us as soon as the Bigly is back. But we need him because he's one of our most eminent economists, and he will certainly give us a very good perspective of the budget. Next to Dr. Pasha, we've got Dr. Pervaiz Tahir, another famous economist, as well as a very well-known writer, a very wry wit, a lovely way of presenting economics. I love reading Pervaiz Tahir's articles. Pervaiz Tahir was also the chief economist of Pakistan, which is probably the foremost title any economist can hold. The title that Mahbubullah held before him, Mikal Ahmed held before him. It's a very eminent title. We also have next to Pervaiz Tahir, we've got Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director of SDPI. Everybody knows Vaqar Ahmed. He's also a prolific writer, a prolific speaker, very well-known economist, mashallah, the future of Pakistan. And then we've got Dr. Aqdas Afzal, another very well-known economist, another very good writer, director of the Social Development Policy Program in Habib University, and assistant professor of economics in Habib University. So we've got an eminent panel here, and we should start our proceedings. To start the proceedings, I've got our own Mahmood Khalid from PIDE, Dr. Mahmood Khalid from PIDE, who will give you a very short presentation of where we are. So Khalid Saab, you have 5 minutes to tell us where we are.
Dr. Mahmood Khalid sir.
Mahmood Khalid, are you there?
जी sir. Unmute भी कर ले.
Mahmood Khalid.
So is my presentation visible, sir? Okay.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, sir, for inviting me to present the basics to start the discussion. What I've taken is...
Khalid Saab, have you unmuted yourself?
Sir, I've unmuted, sir.
Khalid Saab.
जी सर, डॉक्टर नदीम साहब को आवाज नहीं जा रही सर. खालिद साहब आप कंटिन्यू करें, मैं नदीम साहब को मैसेज कर देता हूं.
ठीक. Thank you. So, if you look at the budget strategy paper which has been presented, it basically gives an...
We can't hear Khalid Saab. Okay.
Sir,
Khalid Saab, we can't hear you.
Sir, others can hear me, sir. So I'm speaking. Dr. Aqdas, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir. Sir, continue, sir.
Okay. Okay, so this is basically the budget strategy paper, basically
Can you just
putting
touch
out.
base with Khalid and see if he can hear us? Okay, I guess we'll do without the presentation of Khalid.
Right.
Basic point, I'll say what Khalid's points basically were, which are very simple, that the fund puts us on a trend for increased revenues. There only seems to be one element in the fund program, which is to increase revenues. We've been doing that for the last 50 years. The same program for the last 50 years, it's time we change that, and Shaukat is right, we should change it. Funds seem to have only one trick in the book: increase revenues. And they want to increase our revenues by 2% in a year, which is absolutely absurd and can't be done. We have these very, very unachievable targets that we fix for ourselves, and then we end up being depressed. It's like giving a child a target that the child can't achieve, and then the child ends up totally depressed and unable to compete, and that's become our problem. The second thing that the fund does is gives us really strange targets like, hey, we want SPP independence. SPP is already enough independence. And something like increase electricity prices, which we've just increased today. The third thing is that we don't have anything. We don't have any expenditure-wise. Expenditure-wise, we.
Dr. Nadeem, please unmute yourself, sir.
If not, it's not going well. So if not, we have an austerity budget where we try and control the expenditures, but we do it unintelligently. The result is that today, for example, we can't pay wages anywhere. We can't pay wages anywhere, right? And so that's what happened. And then the final thing is that we are dependent on aid. Our PSTP seems to run away with us, and we can't seem to go forward. And our investment budget is always being misused. So there we are. Khalid sir, can you talk now, or can we hear you? If you can, then you can quickly make your presentation. Khalid sir, can you say something?
Sir, others can hear you. Can you hear me, sir, now? Sir, can you hear me now?
Can everybody hear Khalid?
Can others listen to me?
Go ahead.
Sir,
Go ahead.
Dr. Nadeem, sir.
Yes, sir, we can hear Dr. We can hear Dr. Hafiz, sir.
Go ahead, Khalid sir.
Okay. So this is basically a kind of a brief overview of what the strategy paper lays out. It basically puts almost all its burden on the revenue side. So what it has projected is that in the coming budget, the revenue target should be increased by about 27%. And if you look at the autonomous growth in respect to the framework which has been given, it turns out that in order to achieve this much level of the revenue, they have to basically put in about 7 billion plus worth of the policy and admin measures. So if you look at the tax policy stance, putting up that huge amount of admin measures is really going to put our economy into a misery, which already because of poor tax policy is suffering. Similarly, if you go at the expenditure side, then you can see that the most burden again lies on the shoulder of the federal government, and in which somehow they are putting up that the interest payments are going to go down in proportion to the overall economic activity and as a percentage of the overall expenditures. And within that framework, they are also expecting that the government is going to cut back in terms of their current expenditures. If you look at the federal PSTP, somehow they are also fixing it up, and it has actually not risen from the past many years. It's around 2.6, 2.5% of the GDP, whereas the provincial PSDP is just around 1.1%. So overall balance, what they're putting up for the next year is around minus 5.6% of the GDP. But surprisingly, they are also putting up a figure of about 440 billion worth of the provincial surpluses. So that is something which is just an accounting figure. Once the budget has been compiled at the 30th June, that amount is transferred back again to the provinces. So actually, the fiscal deficit is going to be much more as compared to what they are projecting. It's a tight budget given we have to meet certain structural benchmarks which are posed by the IMF, which especially talks about relocating the burden of the electricity subsidy towards the consumers, and that's going to really put a strong task in terms of having a supply side shock. Now, given the picture of the fiscal deficits, it's surprising that the private sector credit is not only crowded out by the current government's expenditures, rather it's also putting its burden in terms of the earlier rollovers of the existing debt. So if you look at the comparative picture of the budget deficits versus the private sector credit, even in that year in which the budget deficits are going down, the private sector credit is actually reducing and the government is increasing its footprint in terms of the capital market. If you look around in terms of the comparable countries, Pakistan's private sector to GDP ratio is one of the poorest among the region as well as the comparable economies. If you look at the space, especially from the PSDP sides, our costs and throw forwards both are increasing over time. This means that there are new projects and the older projects are not prioritized in the system. As Dr. Nadeem already mentioned, that when we did a small analysis, and it turns out that at the project inception stage, almost half of the resourcing is based on foreign aid as per the project documents. But when it comes out to the allocation, it's remarkably low. In the last year, it was just 11.16% of the total allocations which were made. And within that PSDP, if you see that the federal governments are basically going into domains which are now supposedly of the provincial governments, and they are still putting up large sums in that. In the end, we calculated that how much our investment is efficient in terms of the GDP growth, and it turns out again, as compared to the other regions, that we are at a very low value in terms of our investment creating economic opportunities and activities. So therefore, this is going to be a tough budget this time. Thank you, sir. So I'm done, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood Khalid. That was a good summary. Now we turn to Dr. Hafiz Pasha, who's back. I'm glad he's back. Pasha Saab, can you please lay out how you see, you've made many budgets, how you see the challenges in the new budget, what are the new budget measures you see? And you heard Shaukat Tareen, how would you sort of, in a sense, offer him advice? I'm sure you do that otherwise too, but in public, on a webinar, how would you advise him? And how would you advise him to renegotiate the fund program? Over to you, Pasha Saab.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Nadeem. I'm sorry I got cut off temporarily. That is clearly a reflection of the state of the economy that we are living in. Now, I think you posed a very fundamental question, and it is also in the advertisement for the seminar, which is growth versus continued focus on stabilization. And this is very much the difference, I think, in the vision of the last two finance ministers, the present one and the previous one. Now, I would first like to focus on two important developments, and that is first that the 9-month position of fiscal operations has been released literally yesterday by the Ministry of Finance. And that really gives us some idea as to where Pakistan is heading, at least towards the end of this fiscal year. The budget deficit, they say, is down to 3.6% of the GDP, compared to last year's 3.8% of the GDP. But there are, again, to say the least, a number of problems. And let me say that perhaps some of the problems are reminiscent of the previous era. The first is that statistical discrepancy, which is a funny term, which got used a lot in the previous government's tenure and went up to almost 1% of the GDP, is back again. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why there is there is the return of some people back in the Ministry of Finance, who I will not mention. One of them happens to be a student of mine. The rise in statistical discrepancy is very worrying. It shows a breakdown in the budgeting system, and it's up to 0.4% of the GDP. And really, this is something which we used to see a lot, and it had stopped in the last year or two. The other very worrying development is the big decline in development spending, which has gone down in the first 9 months by almost 25%. In nominal terms, the decline may be as much as 2/3. And the problem here again is this is not consistent with the releases data published by the Planning Commission. Dr. Tahir would of course know that. What we are seeing here is that the actual development spending reported is 277 billion only in the first 9 months, whereas the releases that have been recorded, believe it or not, are 494 billion. Maybe one of the reasons for the statistical discrepancy is precisely this. And this is very surprising that if you have released 494 billion, the system does not have the capacity to spend. And this is bizarre because we have brought the development spending down from 4.5% of the GDP to almost 2%, and yet we are unable to spend. And I think a point made earlier was a valid one, that one of the reasons maybe the inflow of foreign aid has tended to dry up for projects. The other perhaps surprising good news is that the provinces seem to be flushed with money. I mean, this is again a surprise. They are carrying a surplus, a cash surplus of over 400 billion rupees. And this is almost, if you like, 0.8% of the GDP. And the target was only 0.5% of the GDP. So clearly, again, the provinces are not spending. Here we have an unusual problem. The new finance minister talks of raising spending, particularly development spending, but there seems to be a breakdown in capacity in actual implementation and spending on projects, both at the federal as well as at the provincial level. The other major development is the few days ago, the medium-term strategy paper was presented to the cabinet, approved, and then also discussed in the finance committee of the National Assembly. This is a budget strategy paper for the next 4 years or so, and as is always the case in our budget strategy papers, we are extremely, extremely optimistic, as always. So what are we saying? We are saying, inshallah, next year, we will take the deficit down to 6% of the GDP from a likely level this year. The government is saying 7.4, but the calculations are such that at the minimum, it will probably be 8 to 8.5% of the GDP. Now, if it is 8% of the GDP, you're trying to bring your deficit down by 2% of the GDP. You can imagine the kind of emphasis this means in terms of stabilization and the natural impact it will have on the fiscal space for expansion. So if the budget strategy paper has been accepted by the federal cabinet, then I'm afraid the finance minister is coming with a lag. And in fact, this strategy paper was presented during the fact that he was already now in place as the finance minister. So I'm publicly saying something else, but the government and the cabinet has approved a very, very tight budget. I mean, the last time we had a fiscal deficit of 6% of the GDP was 6 years ago. And in recent years, every year we are, it seems that the flow to the budget deficit is down to, is at least up rather to 8% of the GDP. And this is even after a cut in development spending from 4.5% of the GDP 3 to 4 years ago to less than 2.5% of the GDP. So in real terms, the deficit has increased massively. And the reasons for that have already been given, some of them. The point is, if the medium-term strategy paper has been approved by Cabinet, and the finance minister was a part of the approval process, then I'm not sure what is meant by his recent statements. The IMF has given us a quarterly payment of $500 million based on the acceptance of this medium-term strategy paper. So what happens? You want to renegotiate after you've signed off on something? This, I think, affects the credibility of Pakistan. Let me tell you, I've had to deal with the IMF from the Pakistani side a number of times. My own assessment is that the reaction of the fund might well be that, okay, you are now saying that the third attack of the COVID has made it extremely difficult for us to begin to implement the targets we have agreed to for 21-22. So if you want to do this and you want to move away from the tough targets, then perhaps we will suspend the program once again, as it was suspended last year when the first attack hit us, and it remained suspended for 1 full year. Unfortunately, the umbrella of the IMF, it seems we need at this time, because during the period when the fund was with us in 2019-20, and the time when it left this year, we have received $6 billion less in the foreign account, if you like, finance account of the balance of payments. And it is extremely clear to me, of course, that concessional assistance from the World Bank and the ADB will dry up if the suspension happens once again. Well and good if the finance minister feels that he can still survive and move on. Our debt repayment obligations now, 21-22 onwards for the next 3 years, add up to a cool $40 billion. So if he now is contemplating to essentially move towards an expansionary policy, then of course, he will have to plan accordingly to create enough capacity. How can you create this kind of capacity is not clear to me, with all due respects. And I think the whole process has somewhat got muddled with the fund and will need to be clarified. Let me turn very quickly before I conclude to some of the strategy that I would suggest would probably make sense at this time if there is indeed scope for renegotiation with the IMF and scope for changing the targets. If that is the case and our finance minister skillfully renegotiates something which was agreed to and approved by the executive board of the IMF, then of course, what can we do? My own suggestion is let's try and balance the two. Given the external obligations, Pakistan cannot go in an unmitigated fashion towards uncontrolled or extremely rapid growth in the short run. We may hopefully in the next 3-4 years, as the PIDE growth strategy highlighted, if we get our act together and we introduce the necessary reforms, we may get to 6 or 7% down the road, but 5-6% in the immediate future is highly unlikely. So what should be the strategy? The strategy should be that we go for a more modest containment of the budget deficit. Be more realistic, and this implies that we will target for somewhat less growth. My own assessment on the basis of historical experience is that if you can achieve a 1% of the GDP reduction in the GDP annually, that itself is a major, major achievement by Pakistani historical standards. So go for 6 if you are able to keep the deficit down to 7 or somewhat higher if your deficit is higher this year. And instead of targeting, if you allow for the correct base figure of FBR revenues this year, which will be perhaps 4,500 or 600 billion, target for a growth rate of 18 to 20%, which is about the highest growth rate we have attained ever, is about 21%. So this IMF figure of 30-35% is really something off the hat. So let's go for that and try and increase the capacity for development spending, which has emerged as a new constraint. And it's really quite amazing this has happened. Perhaps this has happened because we are spreading far too thin. We have over 1,000 projects under implementation, and a throw forward, as mentioned earlier, of 7.5 to 8 trillion rupees, whereas our annual expenditure now is down to below 1 trillion. So we are carrying a throw forward 7 to 8 times the capacity to spend. I mean, this is hilarious. I mean, I think Dr. Tahir will remember the good old days when we used to try and maintain some semblance of a balance between the size of the throw forward and the size of the annual development program. And what is truly amazing that there are sectors in the PSDP where almost 40% of the funding is going for new projects. I mean, this is hilarious. I mean, really, this is a breakdown of the planning process. So go for a 1 percentage point reduction in the deficit, which itself I think is ambitious. Go for 18 to 20% growth in FDR revenues. And if you can get up to 5,400 billion, as opposed to the target, which is close to 6,000 billion, well done. And raise development spending 20% and temporarily introduce a moratorium on new projects. Full stop. The ECNEC has to take a decision on this and focus on full and fast implementation. Do you know that the delays in implementation are such? The cost overruns on ongoing projects are 250 to 300%. Neelam Jhelum is a classic example of the kind of overruns we have seen. Finally, in terms of the tax strategy, you know, it's truly amazing that the fund has come up in its review report, the staff report after the 5th review, early April this year, in which they're actually targeting next year for a faster growth in indirect taxes than in direct taxes. Maybe the word regressive no longer exists in Washington. The reality is that there is enormous scope for progressive taxation in Pakistan. If I were to tell you that based on almost a year's research, we have quantified the true tax expenditures in Pakistan given to the more privileged segments of our society. I mean, already PIDE has been highlighting some of the other dimensions of the privileges. And for example, today, some very, very striking figures have been given on the real salaries of our top civil servants. I mean, they're very, very high. I mean, about 5 to 6 times the revealed number. What is the position? Today, the tax expenditure due to concessions and privileges granted in the law. I'm not talking about evasion or anything like that. I'm talking about clean breakthroughs and giveaways in the tax system. They add up to, on the basis of the tax base of this year, 1,440 billion rupees. And if you want me to give you a quick breakup, 200 billion to the feudal elite, 500 billion to the corporate sector, 250 billion to large traders, and the remainder, which is about 500 billion or so, to high net worth persons. Let me give you just one quick example to illustrate this point. Do you know that in Pakistan, we don't have a system of comprehensive filing of all your income? We have broken up the income into blocks, and I am, of course, accused of being the father of the withholding tax regime. When I first brought it, the idea was to have advanced taxes. Later on, very skillfully, the privileged class was able to convert the advanced tax provisions into fixed and final tax liabilities. So if you get dividend income, it is taxed, fixed and final at 10%, in some cases even lower. Or if you get income from interest, fixed and final 10%, and so on. All forms of unearned capital income have been converted into separate blocks of income and subjected to fixed and final taxation. End result, the progressivity of the system has been destroyed. We should go back to an advanced tax regime, collected at the standard rates of 10% or so, but it is an advanced tax. And the understanding must be that the tax filer must declare all his income and pay his tax on the basis of his comprehensive total income. This is the case throughout the world. I mean, Pakistan is the only country which has had a policy of clubbing income into separate groups and having fixed and final taxation. This has destroyed the progressivity of the tax system. The other very simple proposal is, do you know that Pakistan has an amazing income tax, personal income tax system? Believe it or not, Pakistan has 12 slabs. 12 slabs. The exemption limit is 600,000 rupees per annum. And the highest bracket at which a tax rate of 35% is charged, believe it or not, is on a person earning more than 7.5 crores per annum. 75 million rupees per annum. I don't know how many people in Pakistan would actually be legally or declaring such income levels. So the idea is a very simple one, and I'm glad that the IMF and the government has agreed to do this, is we are moving to a system of 5 or 6 slabs, which is the case throughout with India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, so on. And my own proposal is that the middle class has suffered due to high inflation. So the exemption limit has remained at 600,000 now for almost 3 to 4 years. Raise it to about 750,000 to allow for the inflation, and have a maximum rate of 30% at an income of 15 million rupees per annum, as opposed to 75 million rupees. Just these two proposals, implementation of this merger into total income, implementation of making the tax system more progressive income tax, these two alone yield 150 billion rupees. I don't want to take your time, and I also don't want particularly to reveal the taxation proposals. You will find that at the minimum, in a very progressive manner, we can generate an additional 300 to 350 billion rupees in the budget next year without harassing the middle class or the lower income groups. And finally, let me say, I totally and completely disagree with the proposal in the budget strategy paper or in the IMF staff report of withdrawing most of the exemptions in the sales tax. They are mostly in the schedules, 8th schedule, 10th, 11th, 12th schedules of the Sales Tax Act. They are by and large, almost all of them are reasonable exemptions. They relate to food, medicines, and so on. And quite frankly, I don't see any margin for raising revenues. There are two items which they will pick on. Fertilizer, where the sales tax is 2%, yes, it's very low. And LNG, where it is 12%. Either way, I disagree. Fertilizer should be at 0 rate because our agriculture is suffering. So overall, I disagree with the indirect tax strategy of the fund and the government. I am in favor of a progressive move, modest, not 720 billion, but about half or less, 300 billion. Bring down the deficit 1% of the GDP, raise the PIDE by 20%, impose moratorium, and try and achieve some stability with some growth. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Pasha. This is a wonderful, very, very, very good analysis. Very pungent and very poignant. But Dr. Pasha, before I let you go, I have to ask you a question. These tax, I mean, since you have been involved in many tax strategy discussions, research, etc., and I think you have played a large part in tax policy in Pakistan. Tell me, why is it that our tax policy, two questions. First, our tax policy seems to me so complicated. I spoke to 2 or 3 businessmen yesterday and asked them, how much time do you spend doing taxes? They told me 30 to 40%. This is the collection of the withholding tax and documentation and visits to the FPR, etc. Is our tax policy retarding growth? 2, you made some very good proposals, and I can see them very clearly. Tax expenditures, for example, as you said, it's 1.44 trillion. Can we not make some gains from tax expenditure reduction? What sort of a time frame do we need to reduce these tax expenditures? How much can they be reduced? I agree some may not be totally capable of being reduced, but there should be some element that can be reduced in a reasonable amount of time. 3, as you said, this full and final regime, this has been bugging you, I know, for the last 10 or 15 years. Why the hell can't we get rid of this? So my question to you is, how is tax policy made in the country? You've been in the room many times. How can we improve it? Third question, is there any research on tax policy being done apart from you? Does FPR do any research? Do they base tax policy on research, or is it arbitrary measures that they throw in at the end of the year? Over to you, Dr. Pasha.
Oh, very relevant questions. Nadeem, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Very well.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. And if I can be honest, and even though it's, perhaps I should be more careful. One of the reasons why I have not gone back into government, despite being asked more than once in recent years, is because I cannot work in a system which is privilege and elite driven, with all due respects. This classic example is agricultural income tax. We have been trying to introduce this for the last 50 years. Do you know what is our total collection from the agricultural income tax? 2.5 billion rupees. When the income of the top 1% of the farmers who own 22% of the prime land in this country, minimum estimate of net income is over 1 trillion rupees. Now, there is no way you can begin to tax them because this is a provincial subject and there is dominance in the provincial assemblies by the rural elite. There are so many other examples where concessions have been made on the grounds of the access that different vested interests have to policy making. And quite frankly, that is the reason why many of us have not gone back into government. I would like all of you to please have a look at the latest Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Program, which quantifies precisely all these privileges. Tax policy, believe me, I made a presentation to the Honorable Prime Minister way back in September last year, and he promised that it would be implemented. And some of the proposals that I gave were similar to the ones I've mentioned today, but they were not implemented. So that tells you how difficult it is to have reform in a tax system. On this issue of research on tax policy, I mean, I've had at least 15 MPhil and 3 PhDs on this subject. The problem is not that we don't know what the problem is. The problem is the power structure of your country and the unwillingness of the top 1% of the country to contribute to tax collection. If that were to happen, believe me, these extra 1,000 billion rupees, even if we can't get to the full 1,400, the only part of tax expenditures I'm willing to retain and support are, in the current context, fiscal incentives for investment, like the tax credit for BMR and the initial depreciation allowance. But believe it or not, these are the two that have been withdrawn in agreement with the IMF. But the real ones, IMF, last 20 years when I used to negotiate with them, I used to tell them, why aren't you talking about progressive income taxation? And I've never got an answer even from the IMF to this day, because probably the IMF also likes to work within the existing power structure. So let me stop here. I've been a bit frank. Please forgive me.
No, Pasha Sahib, we need as much frankness as possible. If people like you are not going to be frank, then this society is dead. All our intellectuals should be frank. There is no subversion in being frank. We have to be frank for a good policy debate. When I mentioned no research, I know there's research, but does the government use the research that is available? Or does the policy table refuse to recognize research? That is one question that I still have for you. The second question is, Pasha Sahib, is simplification not likely to induce growth? One of the reasons that I feel, my hypothesis, you can clarify this, my hypothesis is that complication in the tax structure may be good for rent seeking, but it is slowing down our economy enormously and it is scaring businessmen from investing. Is that hypothesis valid or invalid?
Both. I mean, the first question I should have answered more carefully. You know, one of the interesting things, Dr. Nadeem, is that the World Bank has had a tax reforms project ever since the early 2000s. And it's been, to say in very simple terms, and today they currently have yet another vintage of a tax reform project. And little or no change in tax policy is taking place. The preference for complexity in the acts or in the ordinances is because it gives more discretionary power to FBR officials. And it creates a kind of a harassment cost which people would like to avoid, and therefore there are side transactions. The initial objective of starting a simple withholding tax system was to simplify the system, but then it got used to make it into final and fixed liabilities, which was not the intention. The intention was to have a simple advanced tax system. The problem now is that 65% of the withholding tax is not collected by FBR. It is collected by the so-called withholding tax agents. So you have a company which is collecting 10 to 12 types of withholding taxes. Imagine the kind of harassment that they're going through. They're having to actually maintain in their finance departments specialized people to collect and pay these withholding taxes. This has to stop. If not, the least we need to do is to have a system of compensating them for the cost. And I've suggested that today the income tax cost to the FBR is only 0.7% of the GDP. They are allowed, according to the NFC award, 1% of the GDP. So for God's sake, the companies, if they have to continue as withholding tax agents, please at least give them the 0.3% of whatever they collect as a legitimate cost of collection. The other breakdown in the system, and which is really very, very tragic, is because of the delays in the payment of refunds. And the starkest and the most vivid example of this breakdown is in the sales tax zero rating on exports. Previously, we used to zero rate everything. Now we're only zero rating exports. Do you know that year-to-year fluctuations, 1 year, 2 years ago, we gave a refund back of 72 billion rupees. Last year, it was better because they had a special budget provision and we gave back about 192. The actual amount of pending refunds could be in hundreds of billions of rupees. We have to do what Bangladesh has done. Determine on the basis of input-output coefficients what the refund ought to be by item, and at the time of export receipts, automatically, along with the official exchange rate conversion, add on the 4 or 5%, which is the due amount of sales tax refund, and compensate immediately the exporters at the time of export receipts. Believe me, the exporters will perhaps thank Allah for this kind of a simplification of the tax system. Bangladesh done it, and they've done a beautiful job, and they have very cleverly and sophisticatedly varied the rate somewhat among commodities so as to promote some emerging items. We may do something similar, but the principle, so that it is not contested in WTO, is that we should automatically, on the basis of input-output coefficients, work out standard sales tax refund rates and give them to the exporters. So there are these obvious mechanisms, but the problem is transactions lead to side transactions. And this is the tragedy of your country today, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you, Dr. Pasha. Let me turn to Pervaiz Tahir. Pervaiz Tahir Saab, you have been the chief economist of the country. Dr. Pasha has laid out some ideas. I would like to hear your ideas on the budget, negotiation with the fund. But in particular, Pervaiz Tahir Saab, your experience in the government, please tell us. You've been in the government for a long time. You are a good economist. You know things well. Where is the problem? Why is our planning system so bad? This throw forward problem has been there for the last 20, 30 years. The cost overrun problem has been there for a long time. The planning machinery has broken down. Our tax machinery has broken down. Pervaiz Tahir Saab, give us some solutions, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadeem. Of course, there are no quick solutions, but let me first say that this webinar reminds me of the first 3 budget seminars we held at Beach Luxury in Karachi. Hafiz would remember.
Yes.
And for the first time, he gave this idea of inflation being an income class struggle. Remember that?
Yes.
Now, those were the days. Nadeem has asked, why do we have a problem? Well, we don't think about our problems, so we continue to have our problems. And here is a man who has now come from nowhere, occupies the principal seat of economic policy, and has made claims, I don't even know, without consulting those who have to support him in this effort. Now, the 3 of us sitting here have signed up on a new growth framework, and we should welcome the shift that he is talking about. But that is as far as it goes. You know, he says that he wants to renegotiate with the IMF, and there are vibes today from IMF that they are willing probably to talk, but then I noticed they're talking about problems related to COVID, the third wave, and so on. So they might probably be willing to give some more assistance related to COVID, but renegotiating is not something that they are known for. And generally, all donors, Hafiz would agree with it, they they are willing to lend more, but do not really want to reschedule. But anyway, let's see that the new promises of a shift towards growth are being made at a time when the economic situation and the fiscal situation and even the monetary situation is very tight. How is he going to do that? First of all, we have to see, and I'm sorry to talk about these things, but I think I have to because the promises are being made, and we need to sort of have some kind of discussion on how credible are the promises. You see, if if the government wanted to make it all credible, they would not have appointed a finance minister for 6 months. They should have gone for making him a senator or something so that he can do this work. The gentleman was asked, how is he going to overcome all the resistance that is there in the government? And he said, well, he did it before, and he talked about fixing the Habib Bank and forgot the Silk Bank, which still requires fixing. So that's another part of the story. But let's see what is on the table. He's saying the right thing, that we have had too much of taxation. We are not going to increase taxes, and that is one of the IMF conditions. We are not going to increase the power tariff. That is another condition of the IMF. And he says he's going to renegotiate. The question is, why doesn't he look at the spending side? The IMF has not stopped him from doing that. There is something that has to be done there. PSDP was just mentioned. Money has been released, but money is sitting somewhere. It is not enough to release money. It also has to be spent, and that requires capacity. Recently, another dimension has been added. There is this fear of spending, the so-called NAB fear. How the new finance minister is going to overcome that. In the PSDP itself, you will see, even with this small percentage of GDP, there's a lot of useless things sitting there. They should not be there. And the focus should be on projects that yield some return, and not projects like the FBR reform project, which is not going to give any return anyway. It is not TARP, it is TRAP. The abbreviation was TARP, but I always called it TRAP. And remember, Hafiz, at the beginning, in the first year, they had promised that they will increase the tax to GDP ratio at the rate of 1% every year. What we have is stagnation at around 10%, and of course, going down. Now, within spending, why is federal government spending in areas which post-18th Amendment belong to the provinces? And why sort of they have to rely on the surpluses of the provinces, which are notional? They should ask the provinces to foot the bill of those services. And, Higher Education Commission is one example. The Constitution only says we need a regulatory authority to maintain standards. That's it. And that is like NEPRA, would not require a lot of money. All other things, and including the funding of universities by the federal government, it should be stopped. They have no business doing it. The provinces should do it. The result is that provinces are starting universities in each mohalla because the funding is going to come from the federal government. That is one thing. The second item of expenditure, pensions. We keep talking about pensions, and some horrendous pictures of pensioners in Rawalpindi the other day show the fate that they are suffering. But anyway, the major part of the pension is the military pension. Now, we have a military-industrial complex which claims that it works for the welfare of the Jawans. Well, they should sort of set up a fund for pensions. Why can't it be done? Similarly, we can allow a bureaucratic industrial complex and they can set up a pension fund of their own if the other guys can do it. So what I'm saying is, my point is, look at the expenditures. And then another point that I want to make, and that was the main point of the new growth framework we have signed up on, that what is important, more than the investment rate, which we now find it difficult to increase, is the software of growth. I mean, it was just mentioned that money released are not being spent. Similarly, the private credit to banks was mentioned. Hafiz, I looked at the number. In 80s, banks were nationalized, but the credit to private sector as a percentage of GDP was much higher. Nationalized bank. So, I mean, the banks are having it easy. In fact, they help the government in very interesting ways. I was the chairman of Punjab Bank. One day, just before the budget, an FBR member turned up and wanted us to pay our taxes in advance so that they can show that they collected, the collection was in that year. Now, these kinds of tactics have to stop. So I would say, do nothing on taxes if you want to go for growth. Focus on spending. And the incentives that were given to the investors, and Hafiz said they have been withdrawn, should actually be brought back. If the objective is to get growth going. Now, I was asked a very fundamental question, what is wrong? Well, nobody in this country now knows what is wrong. We have to, all of us, get together and try to sort of find out what is wrong. I think there is a lot that is wrong. I mean, I sometimes think that when this new government came, if they had done nothing, the economy would have done better. You see, the system would have somehow moved on. But their idea of stop goes, their ideas of touch and goes, their ideas of this during the day and that in the middle of the night, and in the morning, you have the morning after. You know what that means. I will stop here and will join the discussion. But on taxation, when I say do nothing, I am not saying that don't expand the base. Agriculture has to be added, and there are a few other things they have also to be added. And also, the provinces have to really now focus on mobilizing what is called provincial taxes much more than they have done so far. And the property tax, which has tremendous potential, and everywhere in the world it is the third largest tax. Here, there is nothing to write home about. We should focus on that. But my suggestion, therefore, is that we will have to have a separate webinar on the provincial budgets also. Thank you.
Thank you, Pervaiz sir. Thank you very much. Very good points. But Pervaiz sir, you can't get away so easily. Tell me, is the planning system working? You're saying money is released and it sits somewhere. I mean, that's very bizarre. Why? How can the money sit somewhere once it's released? I mean, somebody has to use it. Secondly, you're saying that we don't have the capacity to spend money. I mean, that's kind of, again, a bit bizarre. So can you please tell me, we've got a very large planning commission. I think it is about 2,000 people in it. Do they have the capacity to do the PSTP, and do they do it right? Can we get more bang for the buck from the PSTP? We've done a book on this, and we seem to think that the PSTP can be better spent. and the controls are not there. The cost benefit is not done. So can we reduce the development budget substantially and still have a growth? Over to you, Pervaiz.
Well, you don't need to reduce development budget, but of course, spending is a different ball game. As I said, these days there is this fear of NAV. People don't really want to take the risk of spending. I don't know what to do about that. But Planning Commission itself now is an organization which doesn't know what to do. They only are a project approving authority. They do not focus on projects, their implementation, monitoring. In fact, I'm told that what was called PC5, which is some kind of an evaluation to learn lessons from what was done in the project implementation, there hasn't been a PC5 for the last 10 years. That's what I'm told. There are 11 members now. There used to be 2. I think there are too many people running into each other. But we can't just blame the people. The role of the Planning Commission itself in the economic decision making has declined ever since we started getting into the IMF programs. Development budget effectively is controlled from Q block. Planning Commission just approves the project.
Dr. Nadeem, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Pervaiz. But again, Pervaiz, just quickly before you go, no, don't go anywhere. You're with us. But just quickly, what about expenditure reduction? You talked about provinces, yes, of course. But doesn't the 18th Amendment require the federal government to shrink? Should the federal government shrink? If so, how can it shrink? I know Aqdas has made up a list of about 500 departments that should be closed down, that are not closed down. Secondly, again, I come back to the subject of capacity. Does the federal government have the capacity to make good policy, or even the provincial government? Do we have capacity in our government, just like Pasha Sahab just illustrated? TD tax research exists, tax ideas exist, but does the government have the capacity to absorb such research? Now, you and Pasha both have been in the ECC. Are these issues even discussed in the ECC? Does the ECC take policy consideration seriously? Does cabinet discuss economic policy? Can you go into those ideas, please, a little bit?
Well, I have never seen detailed discussions other than, you see, where should a project be located, things like that. I've never seen serious discussion on policy. The only thing that excites the cabinet sometimes are the prices. Now, prices, you know, are a provincial domain. There's nothing that the federal government can do about it, but they keep talking about it. The latest funny thing is that they found this gap between the wholesale index and the consumer price index. Well, there is always a gap, and they thought it should have reduced by now. There is a lag involved there. It cannot immediately translate into it. Another nugget is that they want the Sasta Bazaar prices included in CPI. Now, you know, the CPI has a system. If Sasta Bazaars are regular markets, they will be included. But let's say they are the lower end markets. You have to balance them with the higher end markets, and the average will still be high. Now, these simple things are so difficult for us to make them understand. What can we do there? So I don't know. New finance minister, is involves noise, sound, what is it? Sound and fury. There is that expression that is there more fury or there's sound and fury signifying nothing. Now I remember it. So let's wait, but I'm not very optimistic. My recommendation, though, is to take him on this because we have brought out a good framework and we should sort of get involved with him if we can help. He will not have a team that can do it.
Can I come in with a word?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Nadeem,
Ji, Pasha.
can I just make one or two points before?
Go ahead, Pasha.
Okay. And let me, this issue about the institutional framework for policy making and the capacity to support that institutional process is indeed now a very fundamental question. And I'm glad you've raised all the right questions today. You see, the makers of our constitution, which we all greatly and totally respect, had built in two major constitutional fora for policy making and for resolving issues of policy. The first is the National Economic Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, staffed with experts and so on and so forth, the chief ministers and nominated people. It doesn't meet. It is supposed to meet at least quarterly every year. It just does not meet. The NEC has been effectively preempted by the ECC. Now, the difference between the NEC and the ECC is that the National Economic Council is a federal constitutional body and has representation from the provincial governments, whereas the ECC has only federal ministers and others, no provincial representation. So the complex issues, for example, this massive overlap between the federal PSDP and the provincial PSDP. You'll be amazed that out of the 200 odd projects of the National Highway Authority, 172 are intra-provincial roads. What the hell is the National Highway Authority doing building roads connecting two cities within a province? So this kind of issue has to be resolved by the other constitutional body, which is the Council of Common Interests. Again, does not meet. And where it does meet, there's huge controversy. They've been fighting over the census of 2017. No resolution. So the policy framework within the constitutional mandate has broken down completely. And this is the real tragedy for our country.
And may I say something here?
Go ahead.
Well, I would say that Planning Commission should actually function as a secretariat of the CCI and National Economic Council.
Exactly, agreed.
And the members should come from provinces. And similarly, a National Tax Authority under the CCI collecting taxes at all levels of government, it will satisfy the spirit of the Constitution and also will improve the functioning, the economic functioning of the Federation.
Hello.
Dr. Hafiz, please continue, sir.
Just wanted to make one or 2 points about the very important issue of pensions, which was raised by Dr. Tahir. And as usual, he always identifies the right problems. Now, he did mention that the largest component of pensions are military pensions. But actually, if you were to add the pensions of the 4 provinces, they add up to 600 billion, while the federal, provincial, and civil and military add up to about 450 billion or so. A very interesting statistic for you. This time, first time in history, in the first 6 months of this year, pensions have actually come down. So maybe the government has decided to delay the payment of pensions because it has steadily been growing at 15 to 16% per annum. The total liabilities of pensions to Pakistan today is over 1,050 billion. And if we don't begin to resolve this problem, and the point that he made about the military industrial complex, the largest conglomerate entity of Pakistan today is the Fauji Foundation. And if we include other entities within that, the various foundations and the amount of money that is potentially available that can be made through the defense housing authorities, my own humble suggestion is that I completely and totally agree with Dr. Tahir, and this is something we have dealt with also otherwise in our reports, is potentially the capacity to self-finance pensions exists within the military complex. But my real worry now is provincial pensions. They're exploding. Do you know that Punjab alone will be approaching 250 to 300 billion in the next few years? And unless we begin to resolve this, I mean, isn't it a strange condition today in Pakistan that pensions are costing us more than what we are spending on development as a country? I mean, this gives you an idea of the expenditure priorities of your country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha. This is the time for an interesting transition that we planned for. As you know, this webinar is joint between PIDE and IPRI. IPRI is a younger organization, PIDE is an older organization. So we tried to organize this webinar for young versus old. So Dr. Pasha, Dr. Tahir, myself, we represent the older generation. A few days ago, I wrote an apology from our generation to the younger generation. So let's bring the younger generation in. Pensions is the right time to bring them in. Yes, we are leaving you with a big pension burden. But Vaqar sir, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed of SDPI, Dr. Vaqar, I think we've been talking about pension reform since you were a child. I think this definitely since before you started discussing economics. And we've just been discussing all these themes for the last 30, 40 years. Dr. Vaqar, you of the younger generation, how do you see the failure of our generation? And are you going to be able to carry the baton forward? Are you going to be able to do the tax reform? Is your generation going to be able to do all the things that Dr. Pasha and Dr. Tahir have talked about? Or will you be sitting there 50 years from now apologizing to the next generation like I am apologizing to you? Dr. Vaqar.
Nadeem, can I say something here?
If you must.
Yeah. Talking about capacity issues and so on. I was guilty of sending Vaqar for a PhD abroad, and for 10 years, I faced an audit objection on that.
Okay, Vaqar sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sab. And in the 19th year of my career, if somebody calls me the younger generation, I'm really pleased. So thank you. So it's been a while that it's been a while that somebody calls us a younger generation. But really, let me start by thanking yourself. It's a rare privilege to be among three of my former bosses and mentors. And all three of them have really shaped my opinion or whatever my thinking around the reform process has been in the recent years. I would focus very briefly on four specific things. One is the budget forecast, and a large part of that has been covered by Dr. Pasha, so I'll be brief. Second is finding fiscal space in the budget to achieve what Prime Minister is asking for, which is growth and jobs. And the third is to avoid unrealistic assumptions in the budget. And finally, talking a bit about how to adhere, high-level principles of fiscal transparency, participation, and accountability in the budget. So let me quickly jump to the budget numbers. If one carefully studies the documents and minutes from the recent meetings at MOF since the fourth finance minister has joined in the current government, the broad contours of the budget are being prepared with an economic growth assumption of 4.2% for the next year. And inflation is being assumed at 8%, and we let the audience decide if this is unrealistic. A national or consolidated, as we call, budget deficit to GDP ratio of 6% is being assumed. And with these assumptions, the government would like to keep the public debt to GDP ratio around 84% in fiscal year 22. Based on these numbers, we are expecting a net federal revenue of 4.5 trillion for FY22. However, owing to the third wave and other challenges, the federal expenditure is expected to be around 8 trillion. And this essentially leaves us with a fiscal deficit at 7% of GDP. My own view is, and Dr. Pasha did talk about the medium-term strategy paper, my own view is that MOF's paper may need to be revised if the 4 key goals provided by the Prime Minister in the Economic Advisory Council have to be achieved. And these goals were growth, jobs, social protection, and arresting inflation. So the projected economic growth as per the government source, even if we take the more optimistic outlook, it's assumed around 5% in 2024. Now, certainly those of us who have been around for some time, one cannot expect to mobilize the job numbers with this level of growth. And at least the target of jobs provided in PTI's manifesto may not be realized. How would the fiscal policy be helping the investment rate, particularly the private investment rate? I also found that missing in the analysis presented in the budget strategy paper. Second, the efficiency of our social protection seems suboptimal, and Dr. Pervaiz Tahir did talk about the expenditure side. And now we already have evaluations out there which are asking for improved targeting under Ehsaas, under Naya Pakistan Housing Scheme, under Sehat Card, under Kamyab Jawan, and host of other packages like South Balochistan package, Karachi package, South Punjab package. And as a first step, if one is to improve this targeting, the Finance Act will need to pave way for integrating the nationwide databases, including the NADRA database. And unfortunately, when one is designing such social protection programs, may you be from a provincial government or the federal government, there's a trust deficit across the federating units, which doesn't allow data sharing. And that trust deficit needs to be addressed, perhaps starting from the CCI level. Let me quickly turn to the second part, which is how do we find the fiscal space in short, medium, and longer term? So while we have heard many of the usual popular messages, and IMF report also talks about it, budget strategy paper also talks about it, about taming the circular debt, losses of 11 leading state-owned enterprises, untargeted subsidies, tax exemptions, which Dr. Pasha talked about, grants by federal government, reducing size of federal government, merging ministries and line departments, and removing duplication in PSDP and ADP. Now, we have this habit of really picking and choosing amongst this laundry list of things to do. So I would suggest that certain principles have to be locked in when one is creating the fiscal space. First is the fund program. And I'm mindful that talking about the fund program is unpopular at this stage, but I would really like to invite attention towards those challenges which the fund report points out, which have been our mistake for long. And we have a reluctance to go all the way with those leakages which need to be plugged. And I'm concerned that as government begs for leniency from IMF, the government will only be targeting at the softer commitments and not those requiring the adjustment going forward. Already we are hearing on these lines from the leadership who believes that IMF would exhibit leniency due to the third wave. However, there's a weak commitment to what we are going to promise in lieu of the leniency. For example, a drastic reduction in the tax giveaways, which Dr. Pasha talked about. Second, let's also be realistic on the taxation side and what we can deliver from the taxation side to create the fiscal space. I'll cover two arguments here, one in favor of the tax bodies and the other against them, because a lot has been said against them. So let's first hear the first argument, which is that tax administration is now demanding, if you look at their Senate Standing Committee presentations, if you look at their presentations in EAC, they are demanding the kind of autonomy which one has been debating for example, the central bank or the key regulators. I think we should be open to debating this and whether this is a fair demand or not. We also need to ask ourselves the question, how to insulate the tax, insulating the tax machinery from the political influence. And that's a fair question, of course, because the political influence is large when one talks about these tax bodies. But then again, a favor against them, of course, has been that theoretically, the largest tax base as per the GDP size should be the services sector, for example. However, we now understand that the way these tax bodies have implemented GSTS, it's been a growth killer and even a revenue killer, I would say. And the lack of GSTS harmonization across provinces is stifling our services economy and not enabling them to participate in international value chains in services. Perhaps this is why I have placed a lot of my bets on PRMI, the Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative. And within PRMI, we hope that the Finance Act would strengthen many of the things which PRMI Secretariat wishes to do on tax-related harmonization first. And if definition of bases or rates can't be harmonized, there are various other aspects of reducing the transactions cost, including what Dr. Nadeem was talking about, such as unified tax return, single national audit, other simplifications, which the National Tax Council, by the way, already knows. So one of the other recommendations from today's sitting could be that Finance Act should consider empowering the National Tax Council and not just limiting this to an advisory body. On the reform of public investment, a lot has been said, and I won't go into that detail. However, the reform of public investment is something which we would really expect the planning minister to steer. And unfortunately, there's been silence on that front. And this is an important area as the private sector is not interested in going to vast parts of Pakistan. In such a scenario, the government's ability to design and execute publicly funded projects and enabling infrastructure is critical. And as was discussed, almost all multi-year projects in PSTP and ADP are suffering from cost and time overruns. I'll just leave with one suggestion on the reform of public investment. I think it's time, as Dr. Pervaiz Tahir was saying, that given the lack of capacity, my suggestion would be to outsource the project appraisal function to a third party, to a private party, even to an independent party. And there could be some transparency then, or some resistance to go towards the look good projects. I want to briefly touch upon the third aspect of my presentation, which is a plea of not to make unrealistic assumptions in this year's budget. And my own assumption is that things like surpluses by provincial governments, I think these fall under unrealistic assumptions. One, they reveal too late in their working, even quarterly working. Second, they don't spend. And as we had heard in the initial presentation, there is large unspent amount with the provinces, just like it's there with the federal as well. I can tell you, recently working with one of the provinces, one of the bigger provinces, at the end of the second wave, they had not spent the COVID emergency fund, which they were begging Islamabad for. So it's not just about the fear of accountability, it's my opinion, that it's not just the fear of accountability. More than half of the line departments in this province had never submitted the concept notes to access the emergency fund. So there's genuinely a capacity issue in most line departments, and we should accept that. If this wasn't around, we won't have well-intentioned consultants sitting in these departments. Then, of course, another unrealistic assumption about privatization proceeds and a host of other things which I can go on. But that's the third main big message, that we need to move away from these unrealistic assumptions. The final point is, what are the high-level principles of fiscal transparency that we want to adhere to in this year's budget? It's heartening to see that PFM law is there at the federal level. Two of the provinces have also approved the drafts. So we finally have the public finance management laws out there now, but the capacities to fully implement these are missing. And this is an area which merits discussion. Already, several federal secretaries have written about their varied understanding about this law. In fact, the line ministries are struggling to understand their own roles and responsibilities under this legislation. So this is another issue that if the PFM laws at national and subnational level are comprehensive enough, will they be able to preempt medium-term fiscal crises, including the crisis which Dr. Pasha just talked about, which is with regards to unfunded public debt burden, which is due to double in a few years. And yes, Dr. Nadeem, I'll be around to see, hopefully, I'll be around to see that double if current circumstances remain. Thank you.
Well done. Good.
Dr. Nadeem, please unmute yourself, sir.
Vaqar sir, thank you very much. Very good idea, very good suggestion. You do the younger generation proud, even though you claim you're not younger, but nevertheless, doesn't matter. Vaqar sir, two things. One is PRMI. Can you please enlighten us on what the PRMI is? What is it doing? How is it backstopped? Who is doing its work? That's very important because quite frankly, sometimes donors set up such things without being able to set up the capacity. Second issue that bugs me a lot and bothers me a lot is the capacity issue. I mean, we used to have the best capacity in the world 60 years ago. We staffed the World Bank. We made the World Bank. Quite frankly, our people, Shahid Hussain, Muin Qureshi, you know, so many others, we staffed the UN and the World Bank, etc., etc. We made them. What happened in my generation that we have no capacity? And that you tell me capacity all the time. Anyway, third question, which is also very important. You said that the PFM, which I know was drafted by a DFID consultant, it was not drafted by us. PFM is not accepted by the secretary. It's not in line with our ministries or in line with our method of work. Do we need serious reform in the civil service, as we've argued in our report yesterday, to be able to get the capacity to work, or are we always out of sync? On the tax structure, Pasha Sab does the work, but the civil service doesn't pick it up. On the planning side, somebody else does the work, doesn't pick it up. So is the system out of sync? Vaqar Sab, please tell us.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, yes, the donors have been helping in this space. And I mean, regardless of who designs PRMI, one really hopes that the federal as well as the provincial BOIs would steer the process on their own in the end. We are not even calling it PRMI, we just call it better business regulation. And one just hopes that this brings down the layers and multiplicity of permits and licenses regime, which are faced by almost all sectors of the economy. But the real trouble is that those permits and licenses are not the same. They're not predictable. And as was being discussed, there are transactions costs to adhering to these. So one just hopes that PRMI would essentially generate a debate, and we have hope in both the co-chairs, which is Razak Daud Saab and Ishrat Saab, that they would convince the provinces to do their part in PRMI as well. On the PFM, again, yes, there was outside help to steer it. But if you recall, it was largely a prior condition of the IMF on which the federal government went forward and approved the PFM. Now, most of the things written over there are not bad, are something that we should be doing on our own as well. But I take your point, whether the federal secretaries or the PEOs really understand that what has to be delivered in this law. And I've already confessed that many of them are suggesting to us that whatever the legislation demands, a comprehensive understanding of that isn't around. Finally, on the capacity issue, I think this is serious. The capacity issue in most of the critical line departments who are there, for example, who were there to respond to COVID, for example, their capacity deficits are really in front of us. Their response time, reaction types are really in front of us. And had there been, had we not gone for models such as NCOC, I believe that the lag time in responding to COVID would have been much longer. But an aspect related to capacity issue is that of incentives. So even if the government buys capacity, trains capacity, the government's ability to retain that capacity has been a challenge. And that's another question that we can talk about in some sitting other than budget, of course. Thanks.
Dr. Nadeem, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. ये वीडियो भी मेरा शुरू कर दें यार, वीडियो भी बंद हो गया. अच्छा जी, fine. Thank you. Let me turn to Dr. Aqdas Afzal, another member of the younger generation. Aqdas Saab, over to you. Please tell us how you guys are going to be able to do the reform that is necessary. We know all the issues, the pensions. We're living with you with a huge pension burden. Aqdas Saab, by the time you get into policy, I think the pension burden will be 2 trillion. By the time you get into policy, the tax expenditures will be 3 trillion. So we're living with you with a huge burden, and the system seems to have no capacity to do anything. Now I admit, and I'm sure Dr. Pasha will back me up on this, we have failed. We have left you with a rotten system. So please tell us, what are your views? How are you going to improve the system? And if you were to advise Shaukat Tareen, what would you say should be done immediately and what should be done in the long run? Aqdas Saab, over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Aqdas Afzal, and I'm the Program Director for Social Development Policy Program at Habib University. It's indeed a very high honor and privilege for me to be sharing the panel with such leading economists of Pakistan. So thank you for this opportunity. I think fellow panelists have talked about some of the very interesting and fundamental issues. For instance, Dr. Hafiz Pasha talked about consolidating the tax structure. Dr. Pervaiz Tahir talked about the dire need for pension reform, which you have recently just alluded to. And then finally, Dr. Vaqar also spoke about these high principles for fiscal transparency. I'm going to basically share with you the way I see things from my perspective. And I will also make some recommendations about the immediate short term as well as for the long term. So as we know that the economic and social devastation brought about by COVID-19 has changed the way we used to think about economics, our assumptions about economics. the consensus or the economic orthodoxy, that monetary policy was the better tool or the best tool for economic management, as well as these ideas on long-term stability in public finances. These ideas are now increasingly becoming, they're now unraveling, especially in the US, as we have seen with these massive infusions by the Biden administration from the fiscal side. Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, recently talked about the importance of both monetary and fiscal policy. Andrew Bailey, Governor, Bank of England, said there needs to be very close and sensible coordination between both policies. Olivier Blanchard also spoke about taking on high levels of debt. Carmen Reinhardt, of Reinhardt and Rogoff fame, you might remember these two from a few years ago, that debt management issues should not be in the forefront of public policy concerns. And finally, last but not least, Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF, perhaps the guardian of economic orthodoxy, now advocates the need for extra borrowing and restructuring of the existing debts. So this thinking, economic orthodoxy, that we could not use fiscal levers to bring about, to provide a necessary fillip to the economy, is now increasingly challenged and is unraveling. I mean, countries are listening to this message. Look at the countries in Latin America. Look at what Vice President Kirchner is saying in Argentina after the failed IMF experience under Mauricio Macri. They're talking about deferral of their debt talks with IMF. Similar voices are being heard from Andrés Obrador in Mexico. And let's not forget what Yanis Varoufakis tried to do with IMF a few years ago in Greece, for example. So what all of this means is that we are going to have to renegotiate with the IMF in order to find the necessary fiscal space to achieve a number of things. First of all, I welcome this recent focus on growth. I have been writing about this in Dawn for the past 2 years, that the lack of jobs in Pakistan is not only an economic crisis, it is a social crisis. And a few years ago, I wrote a piece for another newspaper in which I received data from Dr. Dure Nayab, who now works with you, sir. And if I remember that data correctly, the median age for Pakistan at the time was 19.6 years. It must have gone up to 20.5 years, which means that about 110 million people are under the age of 21 in this country. So generating growth, generating jobs is a huge social need in this country. So I welcome this focus. Not only is the world using fiscal levers to bring about economic growth, we can use fiscal levers to address a number of challenges that face us as an economy. I'm reminded here of another research that was done by doctors Hafiz Pasha and Shahid Karda, in which they pointed out that because of COVID-19, about 10 to 15 million people in Pakistan will be pushed below the poverty line. I mean, this is a very, very huge number. So let's see how we can go about dealing with these problems that we are facing. We need to have growth, yet we also have massive poverty. And we also need jobs. So we have three big problems right now. So it's heartening to see that the government has enhanced the PSDP in the upcoming budget. I mean, only today there was talk of renegotiating the revenue target very slightly with the IMF. But I think my advice to the government would be to approach economic policy in a short, medium, and long term. So here's what I'm proposing for the short term. I think when it comes to budget allocation, I think the allocation for SARS/BISP, it has to be enhanced. I think we are facing a situation in which a lot of people are being pushed below the poverty line. So I think we should not shy away from enhancing our allocation from 200 billion rupees to even something like 500 billion rupees. I come back to the fiscal question here. I mean, there's a very important fiscal question, but this is my proposal to double the SRs and BISP allocation to 500. And the interesting thing is that, Keynes reminded us, long time ago about this concept of marginal propensity to consume. Simply put, marginal propensity to consume is an idea that it basically tells us the percentage of your income that you spend on consumption when your income increases by 1 unit. So if your MPC is 0.6, then you are going to spend 60 paisa out of the additional 1 rupee that you are going to gain in income. So poor people who would become the recipients of this enhanced SRs and BISP program, their MPC is very high. So not only are we going to impact or bring about a reduction in poverty with this increased allocation to SRs, BISP, this is also going to bring about an economic stimulus into the economy, because the final impact of that 500 billion is going to be much bigger because of the multiplier effect. This could be enhanced by probably starting public works programs. I mean, we don't have to go very far. We can look across the border at the guaranteed work programs that India runs. For example, the NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. In the medium term, I think in the medium term, I'm talking about probably 2 to 3 years from now. I mean, I would probably advise the government to look at trying to push forward the privatization agenda for those SOEs that are not being well managed by the government. So that's something that they need to look at, and also look at bringing about an industrial policy. I mean, in all of this, industrial policy has somehow not surfaced. So I think we probably need to develop an industrial policy on the way that East Asian countries develop their industrial policies, identifying champions, picking winners, and giving them what have you. And in the long term, 7 years from now, I don't know who's going to be in charge, but I think this is what my advice would be to the policymakers. I think our target should be increasing our productivity and productivity enhancement capital, like education and health, for example. And I think only through investments in human capital, education and health, can we increase the overall competitiveness of our economy. Otherwise, we are going to be only playing with numbers unless and until our human capital is good enough to produce the kind of exports that have a demand in the rest of the world. My final 2 or 3 points. I think where I have made some recommendations for the short term, for the medium term, and for the long term, I think there is also this requirement to undergo some kind of institutional innovation. And my recommendation would be to spin off the poverty alleviation and social safety division into a ministry and give them very specific KPIs like poverty incidence, information on prices. I'm not talking about controlling price, price stability, but information on prices, and talking about job creation ideas. And finally, I think the planning commission has to be made more agile and more innovative along the lines of METI in Japan, so that it can then give you the industrial policy that I talked about for the medium term. I mean, here I'm referring to the work of Mariana Mazzucato, Ha-Jun Chang, who all talked about this. And I think this also addresses the question that Dr. Nadeem al-Haq specifically asked. Does the government have the capacity? My understanding is that it doesn't. It needs to be developed. Final comment is that we have to find fiscal space, because we need to stimulate the economy from the fiscal side. Enhancing SRs, BIS can achieve this while also taking care of poverty. We also have to think about institutional innovation if our economy has to, what's the word, stop its constant reliance on the IMF. Thank you very much.
Can I make a point, please, Nadeem?
Go ahead, Hafiz, go ahead.
Thank you. Very useful observations were made by Dr. Afzal on social protection. Now, let me tell you where we stand in terms of the reality. There is absolutely no doubt that after the first wave, the government did an exceptionally good job of providing for a degree of social protection. Both the State Bank of Pakistan came up with some very innovative refinancing packages, which now have approached 2.3 trillion rupees. And also the fiscal side focused much more on the SARS program and so on. But what is the position now? In the 2020-21 budget, the SARS program allocation has been halved. The number of people covered immediately after the first wave there were 15 million beneficiaries of the SARS program, which was in fact very well done, transparently done, and I must compliment the government on this. But now we are told that the number has been brought down to 7 million. And with the third attack becoming more and more intensive, today we have something like 20 million more people who have fallen below the poverty line since February 2020. So the government, and this of course we were told was an act of stabilization under the advice and pressure from the IMF. The other area is, if you look at the staff report of the IMF, which came out in early April following the fifth review, clearly says that the financing facilities that have been offered by the State Bank must be seen as temporary and withdrawn. And in fact, very interestingly, the State Bank has started referring to them recently as temporary financing facilities. Now, the point is, with the third wave and with poverty reaching levels of 45% of the population, and with something like 5 million people extra who are unemployed, is this the time to reduce these allocations and these financing mechanisms? That is the fundamental question. And I completely agree with Dr. Afzal that at least from the viewpoint of the poor, the people who have very little say in policy making, these two efforts which were launched in the first wave should be sustained through the third wave also.
Very good point. Yes, indeed, I agree, Hafiz, that we should think of the poor, and yes, the pandemic is a special time. Okay, I think we've had 4 good presentations, 2 from the older generation, 2 from the younger generation. There's large agreement on the problems, large agreement on the solutions. But as usual, Hafiz, Pasha, Pervaiz, Tahir, I suspect 20 years from now, whoever's sitting here will be talking the same things, because we are not capable of doing serious policy, but that's besides the point. Let me quickly take some reactions from the floor. Muhammad Khurram Shabir.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. So I am a student from Namal, Islamabad, and I just want to ask that the panelists, they have been talking about the drawbacks of the taxation. So just my question is, can they give any ways and ideas how the taxation system can be improved? Like, although they talked about the refund of the taxation, but I read like a few months back, they introduced the FBI reduced the Faster Plus program, in which the funds can be refunded, and the withholding tax, it's I think almost like in every country. In India, there's tax deducted at source. So and how can the taxation, it can be made but much better, sir. Thank you, sir.
Let me explain that. Thank you. Let me collect the question. I'll come back to the panel. Mehtab Haider.
Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Sir, my question is from Dr. Hafiz Pasha Saab. Sir, as you have mentioned in your presentation that Pakistan required $40 billion in the medium term for the debt obligations. Sir, don't you think the recent visit of the Prime Minister to Saudi Arabia is part of the alternative plan which we are going to place to exit from the IMF program?
Yeah.
Or what are the other options?
Okay, great. Thanks. I'll come back to Pasha just now. Junaid Saab. Junaid.
Ji, sir. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Ji, we can. Go ahead.
Ji, sir, thank you very much. I am Dr. Junaid from Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. Not from economics department, but School of Management Sciences.
Okay, fair enough.
Sir, 9 years back, I heard you in a seminar, Dr. Nadeem Saab, and I still remember that you gave an idea. It was basically we should focus on the policy of making city the economic hubs, the economic engine, because you make a very good analysis that all the policies making failed might be in Pakistan if we can focus that each and every city should be economic hub, economic engine. Why we can't have the high-rise building in Islamabad? We have only one high-rise building. Sure. I saw the implementation of that point. If you have visited the B17 sector, which will be a new Islamabad, I can see a lot of high-rise building, things like that. Within few years, sir, you will see this will be a new Islamabad, and it will not be, you can say, depending on any of the government institute. They will be generating each and everything over there. Already the international brands are coming. My first focus is this very good idea is not discussed even in this debate and what is happening on the country level. I was away from Pakistan last 4 years. I was doing my PhD in France. Second point, when I buy a cup of coffee anywhere in France, the straight away the tax is going in government, you can say, account. There is no need of lot of discussion on tax collection system. Why we are not having this debate that we have the electronic digital economy? As I am paying the tax on ATM borrowing, that is going straight away. You can say there is no need of complicated things. I only want to have your point of view on this only 2 points. Thank you very much.
Cities wala point bada simple hai. This is a seminar on the budget, so we are not raising that here. वो growth के area में काम करेंगे. But let me go back to the panelists for answers to the questions. Pasha, would you like to take the lead?
Okay. I think we have received some very useful comments, and I'm grateful to the participants for having contributed to the quality of our discussions. Khurram Shabir Saab, yes, we have introduced the faster system, but you'll be surprised to know that the amount of refunds that have been given up to now in the first 9 months is in fact lower than what we gave last year. And what happens is that whenever there is a pressure for attainment of targets, the refunds are usually pended. Leave alone refunds. Earlier on during this seminar, mention was made of the fact by Dr. Tahir that there is pressure for advanced taxes. And believe me, towards the end of the financial year, rather than focusing on giving refunds, the emphasis is on taking money in advance. And this is where the system has gone wrong. And I therefore want automaticity. I don't want any judgment. And do you know there is a flourishing market for payment of refunds? I won't tell you what the rates look like, but they're very attractive. So the issue is automaticity. You export $100, you get 153 rupees against that, plus you get 5%, which is the sales tax refund rate determined through input-output analysis. The second point is the issue of withholding taxes. You know, Pakistan is the country in the world which has the largest number of withholding taxes literally in the world. Last count, we have 72 sections of the ordinance, including some subsections relating to withholding taxes. and 70% of income tax revenues are generated through the withholding tax. India does have some deductions at source, mostly for salaried income and advanced tax on corporate income, and that adds up to a significant amount, but it's nowhere near the 70%. In India, the withholding tax regime contributes about 30 to 35%. And I'm excluding advanced taxes because they are in the nature of normal taxes. Coming to this issue of the 40 billion, and this is a number which has been given by the IMF in the report released recently, the staff report. 12 billion next year, 12 point some billion the year after that, and rising to $15 billion in 23-24. God save us. Now, the Saudi Arabian option. Up till now, the position had been that Saudi Arabia was in fact had asked for repayment of the money that they gave us in 2018-19, and most of it has been given. Very importantly, they offered us an oil facility, deferred oil payment facility, if you remember, which was significant for the full 1 year. That, by the way, was withdrawn also. Now, I am hoping and praying that at least the oil deferral facility will be revived after the Prime Minister's visit to Saudi Arabia. As to whether Saudi Arabia will be willing to come in with anything which adds up to contributing to the 40 billion substantially, I am not sure at this point, because only recently have oil revenues gone up. And do you know that they're carrying a record budget deficit even in Saudi Arabia? Well, we can all hope and pray that there is enough gravy after the famous visit by the Prime Minister to get out of the clutches of the IMF. And finally, on the point which is not so much a point of in the seminar, however, the finance minister is on record as having said that 9 cities of Pakistan, over 80% of our expenditure is incurred on these 9 cities. I'm sure all of you have heard that statement of his, which was made only a few days ago. How did he get this number of such a large share going? Because Karachi, the main economic hub of Pakistan, is hopelessly starved of funds. And I'm actually surprised that Karachi, which contributes 56% to the revenues, and if we exclude the import part, contributes 45% of the revenue, I'd be surprised if it's even getting 5% of the public expenditure in the country. So the problem is just the opposite of what the finance minister has highlighted. The point you've made and made in the report was a valid one. If you want economic efficiency, you need to have economies of scale, you need to have economies, and only major cities can provide that. In fact, in our Pakistan's case, we have beautiful examples of cities which are clusters, Sialkot, Gujranwala, and places like that. The cities, even though they're not large, have done a wonderful job. So anyway, I want to thank you all for some very useful comments, and maybe we'll have another round.
We will, inshallah. Can I bring in Zubair Faisal Abbasi?
Thank you.
Faisal Abbasi.
Can you hear me?
See, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to answer this question. My question is to the panelists. Anyone can answer this question. That what are their expectations based on the information they have at this moment, information about the intentions of the government in financial layout? That what are their expectations about the possibilities of job creation? How many jobs will be created or lost? And what is their expectation about the inflation? And the third thing is what they expect during the next 2-3 years, which sectors will possibly lead economic growth in Pakistan? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zubair Sahab. Alia Khan. Last question, Alia Khan.
Ji, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for at least leaving me much more puzzled and confused than I thought I could ever be, because clearly I don't see any way out of all this mess, I would say. Anyway, my question is for the budget. how do you see the tension between the welfare state vibes and the whole idea of the welfare state that is espoused, especially by the top leadership, with the idea that there should be a 4% growth scenario balanced out under an IMF program in the present budget, not to speak of the huge debt servicing burden and the mounting fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. I just want to understand what the panelists can say to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alia. Last question, I'll allow Alia Mubayyat. Alia, are you there? Alia Mubayyat, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Hafiz. Dr. Pasha, regarding really this potential tension with the IMF on changing the terms of the existing program. I guess when one reads the Article 4 of the IMF, one realizes that their view is that there's not much you can do on the expenditure side, and that the work that more reforms are required on the revenue side. That seems to be the stance of the fund. So if given the third COVID wave, do you think that there can be room for a conciliatory win-win solution between Pakistan and the IMF? Pakistan saying that basically there's little we can do in a difficult growth environment, higher inflation, and there is more need for multilateral support given exceptional circumstances. Why the IMF is saying that we kept the GST and the other revenue measures for the June review in order to have enough incentives for the government to undertake the reforms, and therefore not being able to disburse a considerable amount of funding that is due in June. So do you think that Pakistan can afford a delayed or a suspended IMF
Thank you, Alia.
program?
I'll go back to the panel. Aqdas, do you want to take up the question and last words?
Sure, I'll do my best. I think if I understood the question correctly, I think she was referring to what kind of ammunition can we bring to the negotiating table with the IMF. I think COVID has changed a lot of things. I think COVID has forced a lot of people in the West, or in the, how should I say, in people, the gatekeepers of the international political and economic order, to rethink how to move forward. And I think the very aggressive competition coming from China for the present international and economic order is also forcing a rethink in a lot of these corridors of power. I mean, recently, I remember I wrote a piece for Dawn in November of last year, which was titled People's Vaccine, in which I argued that we need to go off of these deadly intellectual property rights on pharma. Lo and behold, a couple of days ago, we have been hearing about the US, no less, talking about breaking these patents. Now, how far are they going to go with this? But the point is, because we are facing such an unprecedented situation in the world, the business as usual way of doing things is not going to cut it anymore. And I think Pakistan may have a lot more bargaining leverage than what we actually know about right now. So I think we may be able to get a favorable settlement, so to speak, as far as our IMF negotiations are concerned. Nadeem sir, can you unmute yourself?
Pervaiz, Tahir sir.
Well, I don't think it's a secret that before the present finance minister, we were not negotiating hard enough with the IMF. There was opportunity, but I think there was no desire to exploit that opportunity. Secondly, I would say a crutch is a crutch, Saudi Arabia or the IMF. I would in fact say that IMF might follow some rules. The Saudis can tell you to return their money yesterday. And that, I think, is not a very healthy thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Huda Looney, do you want to come in quickly? No more questions, but I'm allowing you in, Huda.
Okay, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Tell us where you're from.
Sir, I'm a student from Applied Economic Research Center.
Okay,
and
good.
I'm extremely
Pasha's
honored.
old institution, so I can't deny you. Pasha's old institution, I have to take you there. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Sir, as a youth of Pakistan, my question is that why is it that not only our education budget is very lowest in the region, and it's highly skewed towards higher education. I mean, why as we Pakistanis are not educating our masses? Well, when we do know that this is the sure way to grow. So that's my humble question.
Good question. Good question. I'll get Vaqar to answer it first. Vaqar, any questions, any last words, including this question? If you can answer, then we'll go to Dr. Pasha to round it up.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think it's a very genuine point, and certainly one needs to look more closely into our education budgets, particularly in the post-COVID context, given that education divide is going to increase at all levels, and the fact that many haven't been able to pivot during the COVID times. Certainly, I think we need to now sort of balance across various tiers of education budget, make it more responsive in several ways, including making it more gender responsive as well. I think just going back and making a final point around tax reform, I think there are a couple of maybe 2 or 3 good things on which one can build upon. One is that at least the direction to separate the policy as well as the administration function. That is something that intent has been there. And to some extent, policy has been separated from the admin function. But of course, to go there in the fullest possible manner is still desired. We have seen tariff policy being taken away from the tax body. And now, of course, it's a different apparatus which leads it, a different ministry which heads it. So I think these are 2 or 3 things which we would like to see strengthened through this year's Finance Act as well. But I also want to speak here, and this will be my final word, I also want to speak here with the private sector. How much do they actually, and this is really speaking with the established private sector here, how much they want these tax reforms, how urgently they want these tax reforms, that also matters a lot. You require a very in-depth public-private dialogue to gauge that. You have very big entities, individuals in the private sector who like settlement or informal settlements, something which we may need to give up in order to go all the way with our tax reforms. And I think this requires an in-depth public-private dialogue going forward.
Thank you,
Can I
Vaqar
say
Sahab.
something
Hafiz
here?
Pasha. Ji, go ahead, PT.
Well, I keep wondering, why do we have tax targets? And if at all we have to have targets, why can't have tax targets relating to the base rather than the yield of it? We have to expand the base. Let's have targets for that. And secondly, I think we are neglecting elementary education. Our budgets are focused on higher education. We forget that elementary education is a fundamental right. And we think that probably higher education is a fundamental right. Higher education has to be merit-based. That's it. Otherwise, it's a waste of money. But elementary education, we should go all out of it. And I keep wondering that we talk about construction. There are so many schools to be constructed in this country for the 20 million children out of school. Why don't we do that? Why do we focus on large university projects? Thank you.
Great, great. Hafiz Pasha, sir, can you round it up?
A long but extraordinarily successful and enriching seminar. Let me just respond very quickly to the last few set of questions that came. You see, my view is that the fund, as others have already said, is likely to be flexible and be willing to compromise on the agreements that were reached sometime in March and board approval obtained in view of the third wave of the pandemic. But there is a risk here. We should not have a situation where the fund abandons us and says we have suspended the program like they did the first time. What we want is a softening of the reform process and the performance criteria with continued support in terms of the presence of the IMF program. Now, if the IMF program gets suspended, as I've already told you, given this peak in our external debt repayments, the flow last year after the fund suspended declined by $6 billion. Now, that's something we cannot afford. So the ideal outcome is that, but there is a risk that it may lead to a temporary suspension of 6 to 9 months by the fund. The second point is made a very fundamental point about the tension between the welfare state and the growth orientation by Alia, is always very valid observation. You see, sometimes I wonder about our own Prime Minister's perspective on this. Sometimes you hear him talking about wealth creates more wealth, so let there be unmitigated wealth formation and hopefully there'll be some kind of a trickle-down effect and so on. And then I hear him talking about the need for a SARS program, for Naya Pakistan housing and so on. So I'm not clear whether the government itself is clear on what it's...
You're forgetting Langar Khana.
Yes, and of course, yes. So let's get this clear that the present framework of the budget, the way the 2021 budget came out, social protection was sacrificed once again. And what people do not realize is that 1819, 1920, our meager allocation to education and health as a percentage of the GDP has actually declined. I mean, already our combined spending was close to about 2.5 on education and 1 on health. It's come down to about 3. So this is the problem, and I totally agree with the observations made that our priority, as per our honorable constitution, is primary and secondary education in the principles of policy has been declared as a fundamental right of the people of Pakistan. Let's focus only on elementary education. The last point is what are likely to be the leading sectors in the growth process if we can get up to about 4%. Needless to say, you know that the Prime Minister has a very strong, if I may use the word, obsession with growth of the construction sector as being one of the main drivers, and to some extent he's right. Clearly the linkages, particularly the backward linkages of the construction sector in terms of supply of inputs and so on, is very large, and therefore it tends to trigger off. It's itself labor intensive, and given its linkages, it tends to create more indirect employment. There's a little caveat here, and that few people may have noted that the imports of iron and steel equipment and of other items related to housing has spiraled up by about 25%. So this is a non-trading activity, non-tradable service, which is imposing a demand which is rising rapidly. But nevertheless, I think it is the right priority and maybe we should continue. The other sector which I hope someday this government will begin to realize that at the end of the day, we have to go back where we have always had a focus, and which is the primary sector is agriculture. I feel so embarrassed that 20 years ago we became self-sufficient in wheat. 2014-15, we reached 14 billions of million bales of cotton. Now we're down to 7. I'm absolutely crystal clear that given the linkages, given the employment creation, given the development of rural versus urban areas, we have to go back to agriculture. This is my own humble view. And of course, if agriculture grows, 60% of Pakistan's industry is agro-based. Inevitably, industry will also move up and exports hopefully will also rise. So in my viewpoint, this is my expectations. As far as a 4% growth leading to big employment increase, my estimates that you achieve 4% growth, you get an increase in employment which is just over 1 million. We need to create 2 million jobs annually, and that can only happen if we have a growth rate above 6 to 6.5% at least to get that kind of a target which the government has in mind. Let me on behalf of the panelists say that this has been a truly wonderful seminar, Dr. Nadeem. You've organized it beautifully. We have had a totally spirited and very, very high quality discussion focusing on the key issues. Thank you all, and thank you all very much to PIDE and Dr. Nadeem.
Pasha Sahab, thank you. Pasha Sahab, thank you, but I can't let you leave right now. I have one follow-up question from all of you. All of you talk about negotiating with the IMF. How do we negotiate with the IMF? Pasha, you've been in IMF programs. Pervaiz, Tahir, you've been in negotiations. Do we have, again, the issue of capacity comes up. Now, my friends at the IMF tell me that they are willing to negotiate. They want to see from us a concrete, coherent program that makes sense. After all, we are all people of numbers. We're all people of, we can negotiate the elasticity, we can negotiate this, we can negotiate that. But we will agree, Pasha, when you say 40, okay, I can say 30, but we will have to kind of look behind the scenes and see what the debt scenario is going forward. Will it be 5 years, 2 years, 3 years? This is the kind of negotiation that IMF wants, right? And they want to talk about it. Do we have the capacity to make that kind of program? Secondly, Pasha, I heard you mention agriculture, and agricultural income tax is mentioned by you people. Now, Modi has changed the agricultural sector. Modi has made the reform, and we are not even talking about it. I'm trying to get a discussion on that soon. I will get it soon. So Jeet Bhalla has promised me one after Eid. But we can also bring in reform in the agriculture sector, including the income side, which Modi has done, and we should be able to do that. Once again, the issue comes up capacity. One, yeah, there is some people who are doing the research, but capacity in the government to understand the research and work with it. The third item that I found missing in our discussion is tariff rationalization. Pasha, we still rely largely on tariffs. If I remember right, I think tariff is something like 20 to 30% of our revenues, whereas it should be coming down. Secondly, we move, just like the wheat market, Pasha, you'll recall, yes, we did reform the wheat market. In 2005-06, this wheat purchase is what you call it, that famous system. That system, we had brought it down to very little, and then it started climbing up again. Our tariffs had come down, we had rationalized them to 3 lines, and I think the average was 15%, if I remember right, 25, 26. Today, we have gone to about, I think, 50 lines or something. The tariffs are now absurdly bloated, and we are relying more and more on tariff revenue, despite the government's policy announcement. So this all ties into capacity issue and the IMF program, and our ability to negotiate a better IMF program. So I'd like last comments from you, then we close.
You want comments from me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. You know, I've had the privilege of negotiating at least 3 times with the fund. And there was a time when we negotiated once the entire night, and the next morning I virtually collapsed. And part of the reason why I've been ill the last 20 years is thanks to the stress created by IMF negotiations. However, you see, the point is, you have to have a very clear-cut strategy in your mind and numbers. The IMF respects quantitative analysis. And if you come up with wishy-washy sort of high-sounding statements, they don't get you very far. I mean, you know, the staff tends to be people with a technical background. At the higher level, there may be other political considerations and so on. My own feeling is that either the motivation or the capacity was missing in the previous set of negotiations, as already highlighted by Dr. Tahir. What I see now is perhaps an excessive motivation. You know, my own advice was, rather than scream from the rooftops at this time, it would have been better if our Honorable Finance Minister had quietly conducted his negotiations and then told us what the outcome was. Because by talking about political costs and so on and so forth, he's embarrassing the fund, and this could create problems for us. So my own advice would be, please do your work, and only when you've got a solution, tell the people of Pakistan. I mean, don't try and get political goodwill out of these statements. And as I said, the final outcome should be a relaxation during the tenure of the third wave, but a continued program available to us throughout this period. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Final point I will take up is on the tariff rationalization point, which is a very important point. You know, when Dr. Nadeem, when I first entered the government in '93, way back when I became Commerce Minister at a very young age, I was asked to do the reform of the tariffs by Dr. Moin Qureshi, who was the caretaker Prime Minister. And the interesting thing is that when I looked at the tariffs, I was almost collapsing because the maximum tariff was 120%. Now, on paper, Pakistan has a maximum tariff of 20%. But you know what they've done? FBR, typically under pressure to raise more revenues, they've gone in for a whole string of regulatory duties. Some of those regulatory duties are at 80%, and over 700 line items are subjected to regulatory duties. This is something which has to go. Secondly, whenever necessary, the previous government quietly used to add on 1%, 2%, 3% to the standard rates. This fiddling around is completely and totally incorrect. It's non-transparent. It makes life difficult for planning on the part of the private sector. You have to have a transparent set of tariffs and stick to that. Unfortunately, that has not been the case, and absolutely right that we have, for example, quietly, we have been fiddling around with tariff rates on various key items like high-speed diesel oil and so on and so forth, whenever necessary. Let me conclude by making my final, perhaps most provocative remark. And because I've enjoyed this group so much, I'll make it. My own view is that instead of raising power tariffs, we should reduce them. We have enough spare capacity, 20 to 25% spare capacity, and I've done detailed calculations with reasonable price elasticity of demand for industry ranging from -0.3 to 0.4, based on the whole host of studies, including some in Pakistan. The loss that you have in raising tariffs is in industrial production. Industry contributes about 60 to 70% of our revenues. And I've done detailed calculations that if you raise your tariffs by 15% in overall net terms, in terms of the revenue gain to the discourse, in terms of the revenue loss via tax revenues, you are down by 50 billion rupees. This is a serious set of calculations. So when you have excess capacity, stretch that capacity with lower marginal costs, and particularly to industry. I'm not talking about necessarily on domestic side, but industry, bring down tariffs, you'll get overall an increase in production and an increase in revenues. I am sorry I made such a controversial remark. Thank you.
No, very good point, Pasha. We at PIDE have a report on this that we did recently. You are absolutely right. We agree with you entirely. We should think about it. We have to have out-of-the-box solutions if you're going to go further.
Exactly.
If we keep sticking with the stereotypes, we can go nowhere. And Pasha, I agree with you. There has to be a certain amount of risk-taking in policy too. You can't be safe all the time, right? So yes, I think it's a valid risk to take, a very good risk to take. So thank you for suggesting it. PT, Vaqar, Aqdas, do you want to say any last words or I close?
Well, I want Pasha's view on ending this target, revenue target business, and focusing on the base. And also want to point out that we have an agriculture task force. It doesn't have a single agriculturist in it.
You know, the point is, it's very, very interesting what you have just said, Dr. Tahir. One of my students has just finished her thesis on this famous increase in revenues during the last government's tenure, when it went up from just over 10% of the GDP to almost 13%. Of course, it's back again to 11. But the previous government did manage to increase the tax to GDP ratio from 10 to about 13. How was this achieved? There is a classic and a standard technique for disentangling the growth between what we call the tax base to GDP growth, which is the buoyancy point of the tax base, your point, and the tax rate with respect to the tax base effect. And do you know what the results are? Entirely to support what you're saying. The previous government achieved a higher tax to GDP ratio on the back of higher tax rates. The tax base effect was actually negative. And they had very skillful ways of raising tax rates, which not many people are familiar with. And the previous finance minister used to raise withholding tax rates every year. For example, imports, they've gone up from 3% to 8%. You're talking about tariffs, Nadeem. We have huge quasi-tariffs on the income tax side.
Exactly.
The sales tax raised. He raised very skillfully, quietly, the minimum import duty and so on. So that's real source of growth in tax revenues has to be the tax base effect. And until we realize this point, this fitting along with and I would take an exception only to the extent that you remove tax expenditures. But enhancing tax rates is not the right policy in the Pakistani context. We have policy using tax base. I agree with you, Dr. Tahir.
Thank you.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. Aqdas, very quickly, we've had 3 hours, long time. Let's go.
Right. Thank you for this opportunity. मैं दो बातें कहना चाहता हूँ. I think the first point is I think there is a need to reprioritize what we are doing as far as our economic policy is concerned. I think वहाँ पे ये जो idea है ना, poverty alleviation and social safety division को spin off करने का into a ministry with its KPIs on poverty incidents and so forth. I think that would be interesting. I think the second point has to do with capacity, something that you have reminded us over and over again. And I think in order to build capacity, I think we must undergo a process of reimagining the Planning Commission so that it has the capacity to come up with, industrial policy and so forth. And my final point is this. I think growth के ऊपर focus करना बहुत अच्छी बात है. लेकिन I think हमारे मुल्क में, हमारे माशरे में, हमारा जो social contract है ना, उसको renegotiate करने की ज़रूरत है. ठीक है, growth करने से you can lift all the boats, But I think if growth doesn't come about, we are going to have to think about progressive taxation and the likes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sab. Thank you very much, folks. We've had a lovely discussion. It was long, but great. I think lots of points have been thrashed out. The one thing that is fundamentally clear to me, we are fragmented in every which way possible. Our policy is fragmented, our capacity is fragmented, our institutions are fragmented. I think, quite frankly, it's time that we sat down, put our heads together and built a coherent society, coherent country, a coherent economic policy. Right now, the way to make policy is to, like, I'll remind you guys, when you used to fly kites. In the old days, when you used to fly kites, when Basant, now we don't have Basant, but that's besides the point. A kite used to tear, and we used to put what you call chippies, those little things you used to paste on there. After a while, the kite wouldn't fly because it had too many bloody chippies on it. Once you put too many stickers on the kite, it won't fly. That's the point where we are at right now in terms of policy, in terms of institutions. All of us have been in the government. I see no ministry talks to each other. Everybody's trying to bypass each other. Everybody goes to the Prime Minister's office. Cabinet doesn't work. The Prime Minister gives them sanctions, secretly, no coordination. Policies come out with nobody giving any thoughts, any coherence. I recently read 2 policies and commented on them. I don't think anybody read my comments, but that's beside the point. That's the state we live in. So Vaqar and Aqdas, that's our gift to you guys. We are passing the baton to you. It's not a good baton. It's a dirty baton. It's a horrible baton. I'm not proud of it. I'm sorry. We goofed. Thank you very much, folks. Wonderful webinar. I've learned a lot. Inshallah, we'll do it again soon. Bye-bye.